He is the president of the John Birch Society. John McManus!
To suggest that the next time you introduce somebody, you put a little enthusiasm. Thank you very much for inviting me down here to Pennsylvania. There are a lot of people that wonder, how can the president of the John Birch Society live in Massachusetts? And I always tell people I like to work behind enemy lines. I think you've got a bit of that same kind of problem here in Pennsylvania. Not as bad. In fact, I don't think anybody's as bad as Massachusetts. It's a delight to be here. We're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention and why we don't want one. And, of course, that's going to set us apart from people who do, even if they'll call it something else. They sometimes call it a convention of the states and so forth. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to put it under a microscope. And we're going to start off by pointing out to a little lost awareness. Lost awareness in our country is because people have forgotten, or if they never knew, that America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Amen. You say that to some people and they look at you like you might be from Mars or someplace. You know? But that's the truth of it. All right. And the U.S. Constitution came to us, of course, in 1787 after the convention right down here in Philadelphia. And it's been looked upon by a lot of people around the world as a pretty special document. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England in the 1860s, he said it's the greatest piece of work ever struck off at any given time by the brain and purpose of man. That's pretty high praise. And at that same period, Canada had a new prime minister, the first prime minister of Canada, a man named MacDonald. And he said, I think and believe that it is one of the most perfect organizations that ever governed a free people. Right? It is, in fact, the longest lasting constitution governing any country in the world by a long shot. Right? Now, what's the value of the Constitution? Well, I got 3 points here. We could go on and on and on, but 3 main points. First of all, it's a standard by which to measure performance of elected officials. Our magazine is called The New American. We publish what is called the Freedom Index. And we list every congressman and every senator. That's 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. And we rate them based on their votes for 10 key issues, and we do it twice a year. Now, our people show up at a congressman's town meeting and they have a copy of the Freedom Index in their hand, and the congressman begins to shake and say, no, 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 no. You know, where did you get that information? Somebody will say, well, it's right here in the Freedom Index. Most of these congressmen now know all about the Freedom Index. Some of them really like it because they score well. Most of them do not like it. Right? But the Constitution is the standard. In other words, if you vote for foreign aid and there's no authorization for foreign aid in the Constitution, you get a check mark against you. Right? All right, another value of the Constitution is it grants limited power to the nation's federal government. We've got to have a federal government for limited purposes, and those limited purposes are in the Constitution. If you go beyond them, you're breaking the law. And it's time the American people started calling congressmen and senators for breaking the law. And, of course, breaking their oath, too. And the third reason is it's a restrainer of government's always voracious power grabbing. Right? If the Constitution is obeyed, you don't have to worry about somebody being in the presidency near as much as you have to worry today, because the Constitution is not being obeyed. Now, my favorite part of the Constitution is Article 1, Section 1, Sentence 1. That's right after the preamble. And it says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Therefore, No lawmaking via presidential executive orders. No lawmaking via court decisions. And yet that goes on all the time, doesn't it? It's totally wrong. They don't even get past the first sentence when they start to disobey the Constitution. Here are some of the abuses. The Constitution says that only Congress can put us into war. And so the war power is given only to Congress by the Constitution, and yet we haven't had a declaration of war since right after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And we've been at war quite a few times. The Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money, not to issue money. Coin money. And all they intended there was to take the silver and the gold of the people and smash it into coinage of a fixed size, weight, and purity. In other words, we now had a standard of money. And the country took off because that's what good money will do in a country. And it's important to remember, not to issue. I run into people all the time saying, we got to get rid of the Federal Reserve and we got to get the Congress, the government back issuing the money. No! No, we don't want that at all. Right? All right? Third thing, the duty is to protect the states from invasion. It says that in the Constitution, that it is a duty of the federal government of the United States to protect us from invasion. And it doesn't say military invasion. If we got 10 to 20, maybe even 30 million illegal immigrants in this country, is that not an invasion? Right? It's not a military invasion, but it's an invasion, isn't it? Right. All right, and then the failure to abide by the 10th Amendment. The Bill of Rights, of course, is Congress shall not, Congress shall not, Congress shall not, and all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment that I always like to say, if you forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right. That's the 10th Amendment. Right? So that's just a few of the abuses and dereliction of duty. I'll give you a good example of what has happened. This is enough to make your blood boil, I hope. On October 3rd of 2002, now this is 6 months before the second invasion of Iraq, the House International Relations Committee met to discuss the planning for a war that was already being undertaken by the George W. Bush administration. Now, all 45 committee members, as well as others in the Congress, had sworn a solemn oath to abide by the entire Constitution that says only Congress can send us to war. So at that meeting of the International Relations Committee, a fellow named Ron Paul stood up and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. And then he added, but I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Good for you, Ron. Now the chairman of the committee was Henry Hyde of Chicago. And he actually said this to Ron. There are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. There's your Chicago politician, huh? Now, he was known as a conservative. And I'm a Martian. I know some people in the Chicago area who wrote to Henry Hyde after that, and they said, is the part of the Constitution that says you shall receive compensation for your services, is that anachronistic too? Yeah. They didn't get any answer. Right? Chicago politicians are something. Did you ever hear the story about the old guy who said, he said, when I die, please bury me in Chicago so I can remain politically active? So we went to war in Iraq, and look at this. 4,400 dead, 10 times more wounded, and the country is in worse shape now than it was before we started. I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein, but Saddam Hussein was very tolerant. of other people's religions. There were 1.5 million Christians, mostly Catholics, living in the greater Baghdad area. There's now less than 500,000. Some of them have been killed, many of them have fled, and they continue to leave. We did a really good job on Iraq. Now I'll go back to some of the abuses, making law by executive orders. Here's a fellow named Paul Begala who worked for President Clinton. And in 1998, he said, "Stroke of the pen, law of the land, kind of cool." He actually said that, and he laughed about it. Right? And that's what's going on. Executive orders, Barack Obama has recently said in his State of the Union message, "America does not stand still, and neither will I. So whenever and wherever I can take steps without legislation to expand opportunity for more Americans, that's what I'm going to do." All right? He should have been fired right on the spot for that. Right? That's law by executive orders. Executive orders are totally improper if they apply to the entire population of the United States. They are proper if they apply only to the government's employees. George Washington, for instance, could have issued an executive order saying December 25th shall be a paid holiday for all federal employees to celebrate the birth of the Lord. That's proper. But if he said it for the entire country, no. No, it would be improper. You got to look at the president like the CEO of a corporation. He can issue executive orders to his employees or the people who work under him. But that's not what Barack Obama has in mind. The business of using executive orders has been going on all through the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt was probably the worst abuser of that process. Now, there are people who want to get rid of the Constitution, and they don't tell you that that's what they want. They claim to want to improve it. They claim to open it up for a complete overhaul, and they call for a constitutional convention or a convention of the states. Right? If you had a constitutional convention, anything could happen, as did happen, and we'll get to that. The Constitution's Article 5, the amendment procedure. There are two procedures to amend the Constitution. Here's the first. 2/3 in both houses of Congress agree to propose amendments. They propose them. All of the amendments that they propose must then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And this process has resulted in the 27 amendments we currently have to the Constitution. But you know, if you look at it, you'll see that the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights, and I consider that as much a part of the original Constitution as the document itself. So we're down to 17. And then we find out there was an amendment one time to ban the use of alcohol. And then there was another one to get rid of that one. The Irish came in and took over on that one, I guess. So we're down to 15. 15 amendments in 230 some odd years, which means it was a pretty good document to begin with. So that's the first process. Congress proposes amendments, 2/3 in both houses, and then it goes to the states for ratification. Now, the other process that is contained in Article 5 is 2/3 of the state petition Congress to create a constitutional convention. And all amendments resulting from this convention must be ratified then by 3/4 of the states if the convention hasn't altered or abolished the process of ratification by the states. It could do that. It could do that. And there are people who say you don't have to worry about a constitutional convention because the states would have to ratify it. I said, yeah, if that ratification process is still there. Right? That's a very important point. All right, so we've had Constitution has been amended 27 times, really only 15 times. And we've never had a constitutional convention since 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. They didn't revise them, they tossed them. The 1787 convention met only to alter the Articles of Confederation. But it canceled the Articles And it changed the requirement from unanimous approval of all the states to only 3/4 of the states needed for approving the new Constitution and adding any amendments to it down the road. So if they can go from unanimous to 3/4, they can go from 3/4 to none. And that's the point that has to be made. Right? There are a lot of myths about a constitutional convention. Proponents, some of them, claim that a convention of the states is not a constitutional convention. Hogwash. It is a constitutional convention. They claim that states can control a con-con. No, they can't. Once a con-con is called, it's a sovereign body. It can do whatever it wants. No. A con-con can be limited? No, can't be limited. State ratification process will bar mischief if there's still a state ratification process after they get finished. A con-con can't change the whole Constitution. Yes, it can, and it did in 1787. It tossed the Articles of Confederation, and they presented a whole new Constitution. So you can see why there's never been another constitutional convention. The people who want it, way behind the scenes, there are a lot of good people been persuaded to say, oh, this is a good idea. We're in desperate times. We need do something different and so forth. So let's have a constitutional convention without thinking it through. And I've met people, and they've come and they've listened to what I have to say, and at the end of it they say, you're right, I'm no longer in favor of a con-con. All right, questions? How do you choose the delegates that go to a constitutional convention? How many delegates per state? You get 1 per state, 2 per state, or do you get the same number as you have in the Electoral College per state? Expenses. Who's going to pay the expenses for anybody to go to the Constitutional Convention? Who's going to be the chairman? Nancy Pelosi? Harry Reid. Right? Where are you going to hold the con-con? Well, Hawaii's nice, right? Hawaii would be a nice place to have it, right? How are you going to guarantee the safety of the delegates? Right? Would there be demonstrations? Would there be people out there parading and maybe causing a ruckus? You bet your life in these times there would be, right? Well, happily, those questions have been answered. Article 5 says the Congress shall call the convention. And Article 1, Section 8 grants power to Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers in Section 8 and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So all those questions would be answered by Congress if there was to be a constitutional convention, but we don't want it in the first place. But we do answer. Now, who favors a constitutional convention? Mostly they're people who are quick fix partisans. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no quick fix for the problems we got in this country. And I don't think there's anybody knows that better than the John Birch Society. There's a book out called The Liberty Amendments by a talk show guy named Mark Levin. Limbaugh and Hannity and Beck are in favor of the con-con because of Levin's book. The National Tax Limitation Committee wants it. The National Taxpayers Union wants it. The Goldwater Institute wants it. I got to know Barry Goldwater Jr., and I called him up one day and I said, is it true that the Goldwater Institute is backing a con-con? He said, yes. And I said, is there any chance of me talking you out of that in the telephone conversation? He said, no. I said, okay, nice to chat with you, goodbye. Michael Farris of Patrick Henry College, he wants it. Patrick Henry College preaching neoconservatism. I mean, if you're preaching conservatism, you don't invite Newt Gingrich to come and speak to your students, which is what he's done. Tea Party Patriot, a lot of different Tea Parties believe in a Constitution.
No, sir. Tea Party Patriots. You are wrong on that. I am the state coordinator for Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And I will tell you that Tea Party Patriots does not support a Congress.
I will take it out then.
Take it out.
I will take it out. Very good. It is true, however, that there are some Tea Parties.
You're lumping us all together.
I know, I shouldn't.
Tea Party Patriots is a separate group.
The Tea Party Patriots is an organization.
Movement
That's right.
has 34 Tea Party.
Okay, you win. I'll take it out.
Thank you.
All right. There's a group called Wolfpack. Anybody heard of Wolfpack? Right? Funded by George Soros. Right? What more do you need to know about it? Right? Okay. Now here are some leftists that favor a con-con. There's a group called the Young Turks. There's a professor at Harvard University named Lawrence Lessig. Let me ask a show of hands. How many in this room know anything or have ever heard anything about the movement called the Bilderbergers? All right, Lawrence Lessig was just at the most recent Bilderberg meeting. Right? It says plenty. Right? The Alliance for Democracy. Our country is a republic and not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. Code Pink is in favor of a con-con. Independent Progressive Network is. Progressive Democrats of America, they're in favor of. Sierra Club. Vermont for single payer. It looks like there's a lot of people in favor of a con-con, but who's opposed to it? Well, James Madison is, Thomas Jefferson, Phyllis Schlafly of Eagle Forum, constitutional attorney Edwin Vieira, Tom DeWeese of the American Policy Center, former Justice Warren Burger was the Chief Justice, former Justice Arthur Goldberg, the late Judge Robert Bork, Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, Charles Rice of Notre Dame, Gerald Gunter of Stanford, and the John Birch Society, opponents of a con-con. More opponents. This will surprise you, I think, in some cases. The ACLU is against. American Federation of Teachers, Americans for Democratic Action, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the NAACP, the National Organization for Women, People for the American Way. They're mostly leftist organizations. And some of these groups worry that the Bill of Rights might be canceled, and that's why they're involved in it. And they got a good worry there. Right? I don't like necessarily rubbing shoulders with the ACLU or the American Federation of Teachers, but on this, I'm glad that they are opposing this. Former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. He said the participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had no authority to write a constitution. They were authorized only to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when they got to Philadelphia, they paid no attention to those limits and wisely threw the whole thing away and wrote the Constitution. The chances of gathering people like those who attended the first Constitutional Convention today are very slim. Former Chief Justice Supreme Court Warren Burger, he wasn't opposed to amendments, but he was expressing his strong opposition to a constitutional convention that would have the power to void the entire Constitution. He made that very clear. Now, are there any amendments that I would like to see amended out? Yes. I would like to see a repeal of the 16th Amendment, which is the federal income tax, and I'd like to see a repeal of Amendment 17, which is the direct election of senators. In order to get rid of those, you would have to amend the Constitution, which is what they did with Prohibition and then getting rid of Prohibition. Right? Now, the direct election of senators, not too many Americans, I bet this audience, probably quite a few, understand what that means, but it's so important. The Constitution was written to have one voice for the people, the House of Representatives, and one voice for the states, and that was the Senate. And in 1913, the Constitution was amended so that we now have two houses of Congress for the people and none for. If we had state appointment of senators to guard the prerogatives of the states, we would never have gotten as far into where we are today, and the 17th Amendment has got to go. Now, most of the people who are in favor of a constitutional convention want it because they want to have a balanced budget amendment. That's the first item that you will hear from almost all of the Constitutional Convention promoters. But there's a lot of flaws in a balanced budget amendment. First is expecting government officials to honor an amendment when they already don't honor the Constitution makes no sense. Makes no sense at all. Some balanced budget amendments allow 60% in Congress to override it. I don't think it would be too hard to get that today. Some call for tax increases if the budget isn't balanced, even steering the taxing authority to the executive branch. This is different versions of the balanced budget amendment. Some say the budget doesn't have to be balanced if there's a war or a national security threat, right? They would consider what's happening in Crimea today a national security threat, and therefore we wouldn't have to have a balanced budget amendment. Some say balanced budget amendments provisions wouldn't take effect for 5 years, meaning more trillions added to the already enormous debt. Some say that the way to get around the deficit problem is to declare some expenditures off budget. Now, that's a nice trick that they use, right? They say, oh, well, this huge expenditure of government is off budget, and therefore the budget is balanced, when it's not balanced at all. Balanced budgets generally ignore the enormous deficit we already have, $17 trillion. That's the admitted national debt. If you add to it unfunded obligations, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, you're well over 100 trillion, maybe even 200 trillion. Right? Now, if balancing the budget is your goal, there are two ways to do it properly. First is Congress can cut spending for unconstitutional programs. And the second, Congress can nullify laws and programs. Right? I'm very much in favor of that. We'll talk some more about it as we go along. Go back to the Constitution. Go to Article 1, Section 7. It says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. If the House does not originate a bill for foreign aid, there's nothing the Senate, the President, the Supreme Court, or the New York Times can do about it. It's as simple as that. And I can remember talking to a congressman one time and telling him about that. And he said to me, "Is that really in there?" And I went, "Oh." The power of the purse resides in the House of Representatives, and if the House would use that power, they could stop a lot.
That's right.
Unconstitutional federal programs, foreign aid. I defy anybody to find foreign aid in the Constitution of the United States. Find the word education. Find housing, energy, medical care, and a whole bunch more. Right? It's not there. It's just not there. And the House of Representatives could stop it by simply saying no money for this program, that program, and that program. Right? Added authority, the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The much abused 10th Amendment. Right? So they can cut spending via the Constitution and using the Constitution. No federal expenditures for foreign aid, education, housing, energy, medical care, and I could go on and on and on and on. Right? All right, so that's the first way that we could balance the budget. But let's look at contrasting proposals here. If you rely on the Constitution, you need a majority in the House of Representatives. That's 218, because there's 435 of them, so 218 is a majority. You don't need any in the Senate, although the Senate might want to go along, but you don't need them. And there's no role for state ratifications. Don't have to send it back through the states. You can just, House can do it. If you go to the balanced budget amendment, you need 290 in the House, you need 67 in the Senate, and you need 38 state ratifications. Which is the easier process? The first one, not the second one. Isn't garnering of only 218 in the House an easier process than getting 290 in the Senate and House, 67 in the Senate, and 38 state legislatures? Also, isn't the first method safer? Right? Now, why aren't these balanced budget amendment proponents, why aren't they proposing this? Go to the Supreme Court. I dare say if you ask the first 10 people you meet tomorrow for answering the question, what is the job of the Supreme Court? If you got an answer, most of them would say it's to interpret the Constitution, which is dead wrong. It's an error to believe that the duty of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts is to interpret the Constitution. Their task is to rule that a measure is or is not constitutional, and most decisions should say it's none of our business, it's not a federal matter. Right? We wrongly allow leaders to make a federal case out of virtually everything. And every time I say that, I think of my deceased mother. Right? I would come in as a boy, and I'd have a black eye or a skinned knee or something like that, and I'd be bawling, and she'd say, "Don't make a federal case out of it." My mother was not politically acute, but she said that over and over again. I can hear it almost today. But don't we make a federal case out of everything, right? When it's none of the federal government's business. Now, beginning in 1988, the John Birch Society and a few allies persuaded state legislators in 18 states to rescind all previous calls for a constitutional convention. There were calls for a constitutional convention to ban flag burning. There were calls against abortion. There were calls for a balanced budget amendment. There were calls for this and this and this and this and so forth. And we persuaded 18 different states to rescind all previous CONCON calls. And the states are listed there, the ones that did. Florida went along with it, and then just last year issued a new balanced budget constitutional convention call. Our people in Florida dropped the ball on that one. They didn't realize it was happening. Now let's go back to James Madison. He was our fourth president. He's rightly called the father of the Constitution because he took the notes at the Constitutional Convention. He's one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers, those essays to explain the Constitution to the farmers in New York State so that they would want to have their state ratify the Constitution. Right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've given the Federalist Papers to college graduates who find it too difficult to read. Right? Shows you how our education has sunk because the farmers in New York State could read it. James Madison is the author of the Bill of Rights. He became a member of Congress even after he was president, and he's a valiant opponent of a constitutional convention. He said 1 year after the Constitutional Convention that got rid of the Articles, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstances, I should tremble for the result of a second. What was he meaning by propitious circumstances? Well, the very presence of George Washington as the head of the Constitutional Convention was propitious, right? Washington was greatly revered and greatly respected, and he would walk into a room and everybody would hush, and they would listen and pay attention to whatever he had to say. Along with him, there was Madison, there was Franklin, and the others, and you can look up the ones who were at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Assembling those kind of people today would be kind of difficult, I fear. James Madison, in the Federalist Papers, essay number 40, he said the authority given to conduct the Philadelphia Convention was limited and was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So he knew that they were exceeding what they had been impaneled for, but what he was doing was what a constitutional convention can do, and that is it can do anything it wants, which is why we should never have another one. Now, the other way of taking care of balancing the budget and so forth is nullification. I think some of you may remember that in 2005, the federal government enacted the Real ID Act. And state after state said, no, we're not going to do it in this state. They didn't use the word nullification, but 24 states refused to implement it, and it died. Okay? Nullification is a power that a state has. There was a vote just yesterday in Georgia to nullify Obamacare. The House passed it, wait a minute, the House passed it overwhelmingly, and at the 11th hour, a couple of Democrat state senators in Georgia blocked passage in the Senate, and it died. It may come back in Georgia. We hope it does. If Georgia would nullify Obamacare, there are a lot of other states that are looking around and say, well, if they can do that, we can too. Right? Right? So nullification is proper. Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolutions. Kentucky was the 15th state, and Kentucky wanted to have a statement of its beliefs in print. So they asked Jefferson to help them out, and he wrote the Kentucky Resolutions. Right? He was the 15th state, Kentucky. Now, how many know what was the 14th state? Anybody? All right, you're going to win a trivia contest now someday. It was Vermont. Vermont was the 14th, and when you win $1 million on a quiz show, remember, remember, right? Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolution said that a nullification by those sovereignties, meaning states, of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument, the Constitution, is the rightful remedy. That's what he said, right? And I think he's a pretty good judge of what was the American system. Now, there's a book called Nullification by my good friend Tom Woods. And this book looks a little prodigious. You know, half of it is appendices. So if you want to read about nullification, you'll read in here about Jefferson and Madison and the others. You can get a copy of this book. I think he has one for sale over there, and I borrowed it from him. I'll put it back on his table. I don't steal.
Not for sale.
It's not for sale.
That's
Oh.
endorsed by Wood.
Oh, okay. This one is endorsed by Tom Woods. All right. Tom Woods is a good friend of mine. He also came from Massachusetts, by the way, so don't think that it's a lost cause. The book has been praised by Judge Andrew Napolitano, columnist Walter Williams, Barry Goldwater Jr., the John Birch Society, and a whole bunch of others. Right? Nullification is something we want more Americans to understand, that it can be done. All you have to do really to think about this is to say the states created the federal government, not the other way around. Right? The states came first. James Madison regarding nullification. Nullification of a law can belong rightfully to a single state as one of the parties of the Constitution, the state not ceasing to avow its adherence to the Constitution. So you can nullify a law, and that means you still believe in the Constitution. The process of nullification is not mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, but it's one of those powers that stayed with the states, as is mentioned in the 10th Amendment. Right? So we summarize. A con-con is constitutionally legitimate, but a con-con cannot be limited. Wisdom has prevented the creation of a con-con for the past 200 plus years. Alternatives to a con-con include forcing Congress to abide by its solemn oath and nullification of unconstitutional measures by the states. There's the whole message right there. Another comment. Judge Robert Bork, deceased. In my view, he said, it is my view that a federal constitutional convention could not be limited to a single issue. The original Philadelphia Convention went well beyond the purposes for which it was called, and nobody has suggested that the Constitution is a nullity for that reason. Right? That's good thinking. So we go back to where we started. Lost awareness. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. We got to get back to that. So to whom should you listen? Well, the John Birch Society loves the Constitution enough to want to preserve it. Con promoters claim they love the Constitution, but they want to change it. So whom do you want to listen to? You want to listen to neoconservatives? What's a neoconservative? Well, ultimately, it's a follower of the thinking of a man named Leon Trotsky, who was one of the founders of the Soviet Union. Right? A neoconservative is somebody who wants war and socialism. And when I see neoconservative, I think of John McCain and Lindsey Graham, Newt Gingrich, and a whole bunch of others. Right? We want to test people. We want to find out if they're conservatives. Stop doing that. Don't ask them if they're a conservative. Ask them if they're a constitutionalist. Right? Conservative is undefined and it wanders. Constitution is a written document and it doesn't wander. Right? So we see Rhino, Republicans in name only. Do you have any of them here in Pennsylvania?
Hell yeah.
Right? Again, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's constitutionalist. That should be the test. Right? Do we have unreliable politicians? Do we have establishment leftists? Yes. All of these people ganging up on us to take away our liberty. So you want leadership? Why not the John Birch Society? Why not your Liberty Group here? The people who are members of this Liberty Group, good for you. I'm proud to be here with you. But you know, you can join the Birch Society too. You don't have to leave the Liberty Group. You can be both. Yeah. We reckon it's about how the Constitution has been countermanded by all these different procedures, mostly by the courts, and an awful lot of them by John Marshall, the first big Supreme Court Chief Justice in the early 1830s. I've got a booklet called Realities versus Myths. A lot of people have heard about the John Birch Society and all the nasty things that have been said about us. What's the reality? We got it in a book. We got a book called America and the United Nations, why we should get us out of the United Nations. I wrote a book about one of the greatest deceivers of our time, a man named William F. Buckley, Jr. I call him the Pied Piper for the establishment. Every time the establishment needed something and the backing of some more people, they went to Buckley and he put his stamp of approval on it and destroyed opposition. He did it over and over and over again. Then we have a new book that we just put out called International Merger. It's about these new partnerships that have been concocted, the one in the Pacific and one with the European Union, and if we get into those, they will make NAFTA look like child's play. So we don't want that. The John Birch Society's motto is less government and more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. How much less government? The amount that's in the Constitution and no more. More responsibility. Where do you go to find that? How about the 10 Commandments? So if you get the Constitution of the United States and the 10 Commandments, I claim that with God's help, that would lead to a better world. That's what we want in the John Birch Society. And we're very grateful to have you listen. I feel honored to be here. And if you have any questions for me, I'll be around for as long as you'd like. Thank you very much.